Good evening. Tonight we descend into one of humanity's oldest and most intoxicating relationships. A story not of heroes and victories, but of vulnerability, desire, and the persistent human need to escape pain. This is the history of opium, a substance that has shaped empires, toppled dynasties, funded wars, inspired artists, and enslaved millions. It is a story that stretches back thousands of years, from the first Neolithic farmers who noticed a peculiar flower to the modern pharmaceutical crisis that claims lives daily. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you find value in what we do here, and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see this global community come together. Now, silence your notifications, find a comfortable position, and let's begin this long, winding journey through the history of a plant that has been both humanity's greatest medicine and its most seductive poison. Before it had a name, before it had meaning, it was simply a flower, a delicate, almost fragile thing, pushing its petals through the rocky soil of the Mediterranean coastline. White petals tinged with pink or deep purple like a bruise. Papaver somniferum, the sleep-bringing poppy, a name it would earn 10,000 times over across the millennia. Long before there were empires to conquer, before there were cities to burn or philosophers to debate the nature of suffering, there were scattered bands of humans, our ancestors, their hands still rough from working stone, their minds just beginning to grasp the revolutionary concept of agriculture. Sometime around 6,000 years before the Common Era, in the Fertile Crescent, that cradle of civilization nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, these Neolithic farmers made a discovery that would echo through all of human history. Perhaps they noticed animals grazing on the unripe seed pods of a particular flower, then becoming strangely calm, their usual vigilance melting into a kind of peaceful indifference. Or perhaps a curious child, always putting things in their mouth as children do, broke open a green pod and tasted the bitter, milky sap that oozed from the wound. However it happened, the moment was transformative. They had discovered something that could alter consciousness itself, something that could take away pain, fear, and suffering, if only temporarily. These ancient farmers, whose names are lost to time, began to cultivate this flower deliberately. They selected for the plants with the fattest pods, the ones that wept the most generous amounts of that precious sap. Over generations they refined the art of its harvest into a ritual of elegant simplicity. After the vibrant petals fell away, leaving behind a swollen blue-green capsule crowned like a tiny king, they would wait. Timing was everything. Just before the pod fully ripened, when the latex inside was at its most potent, they would take a sharp blade, a flake of worked flint, or a carefully honed piece of bone, and make a series of shallow, precise incisions into the skin of the pod. Almost immediately, a thick, white latex would begin to bleed from these wounds, beading up on the surface like tears. Exposed to the air, this milky substance would slowly oxidize, darkening from white to tan to a sticky brownish-black gum. This was opium, the raw material of dreams and nightmares, the substance that would build and destroy civilizations. They would scrape this gum from the pods with careful reverence, roll it into balls or press it into cakes, and store it away, a treasure more valuable than any polished stone or woven cloth. Archaeological excavations in the lake dwellings of Neolithic Switzerland have unearthed poppy seeds by the thousands, remnants of what appears to be systematic cultivation. This was not accidental. This was agriculture. This was intention. The poppy was being farmed, harvested, and almost certainly consumed in ways that went beyond simple nutrition. From these humble beginnings in scattered farming communities, the poppy began its inexorable march into the heart of human civilization. It would travel along ancient trade routes, carried by merchants and pilgrims, soldiers and slaves. It would be planted in new soils, adapted to new climates, given new names in new languages, and everywhere it went, it would be both celebrated and feared. In the sun-scorched plains of ancient Mesopotamia, between the life-giving waters of the Tigris and Euphrates, the Sumerians, those remarkable people who gave the world the first system of writing, cultivated the poppy with something approaching religious devotion. On their clay cuneiform tablets, etched around 3,400 years before the Common Era, they gave this plant a name that resonates with innocent wonder, even across the millennia: Whole Gil, the joy plant. For the Sumerians, this flower was not merely useful, It was sacred. It was a gift from the gods themselves, a direct channel to the divine realm. In their temples, priests would burn opium as incense, the sweet, acrid smoke carrying prayers upward to the heavens. They would prepare draughts and tinctures, administered to the faithful during sacred rituals, opening the mind to receive divine whispers and visions. It was used to ease the terror of the unknown, to soothe the existential dread of a people living at the mercy of unpredictable rivers that could bring either abundance or devastation, at the whim of gods who seemed capricious at best and cruel at worst. The joy plant eased the agony of childbirth, allowing women to endure what was often a life-threatening ordeal. It quieted the coughs of the dying, making their final days more bearable. It offered a fleeting, blissful escape from the harshness of Bronze Age existence, where life was, in the famous formulation, nasty, brutish and short. The joy plant was woven into the very fabric of Sumerian society. It was medicine, sacrament, and social lubricant, all at once. As Mesopotamian civilization evolved and expanded, so too did knowledge of the poppy. The great rivers that sustained these early empires also served as highways of information and trade. Knowledge flowed downstream, literally and figuratively, from Mesopotamia to Egypt. The physicians of ancient Egypt, those brilliant empiricists who developed surgical techniques and medical treatments that would not be surpassed for thousands of years, were intimately familiar with the poppy's properties. In the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest and most comprehensive medical documents in existence, compiled around 1550 BCE during Egypt's New Kingdom, we find detailed prescriptions involving opium. The Egyptian physicians prescribed it with impressive clinical precision. It was a key ingredient in remedies for eye ailments, still one of the most common afflictions in the dusty Nile Valley. It was used to bind the bowels in cases of dysentery, a disease that killed more people in the ancient world than any war. And in a prescription of chilling practicality, it was given to stop the excessive crying of children. Imagine a mother in ancient Thebes, her child wailing inconsolably with colic or teething pain, the sound echoing through the small mud-brick house, preventing the entire family from sleeping. She administers a small dose of opium, dissolved in milk or wine, and within minutes, a blessed, unnatural silence descends. The child sleeps, the family rests. But at what cost? We can only speculate about the long-term effects of such practices, about children who grew dependent on the substance before they could even speak. The city of Thebes itself became renowned as a center of poppy cultivation. The Egyptians called these fields the Opium Gardens of Thebes, and the product they produced was considered among the finest in the ancient world. It was carefully harvested, processed and packaged into clay amphoras, sealed with wax and marked with the seal of quality. These amphoras were then loaded onto Phoenician trading ships, those remarkable seafarers who connected the entire Mediterranean world, and sent sailing across that glittering expanse of ancient commerce. Egyptian opium reached every corner of the known world. It arrived in the ports of Greece and Rome, in the markets of Persia and the trading posts of Arabia. It was not merely a commodity in the modern sense. It was an extension of Egyptian soft power, a substance that could quiet a king's toothache, ensure a restless aristocrat's sleep, or provide relief to a wounded soldier. To control the supply of such a valuable substance was to wield genuine political influence. The poppy found an especially welcome home among the civilizations of the Aegean. On the island of Crete, center of the magnificent Minoan civilization that flourished from approximately 2000 to 1400 BCE, the poppy seems to have occupied a central place in religious life. Archaeologists excavating Minoan sites have unearthed a remarkable artifact, a small terracotta figurine of a goddess, or perhaps a priestess. Her eyes are wide and staring, conveying an expression that could be interpreted as either ecstatic vision or narcotic trance. Her arms are raised in a gesture of benediction or invocation, and most tellingly, piercing through her elaborate crown like divine antenna, are 3 opium poppy capsules, their distinctive notched crowns unmistakable even in miniature clay form. This is the poppy goddess, a deity of sleep, of dreams, of healing, and of the gentle passage from this world to whatever lies beyond. For the Minoans, the poppy was not simply a useful plant. It was an incarnation of divinity itself, a manifestation of the sacred feminine, a source of both physical healing and spiritual transcendence. The goddess held the keys to altered states of consciousness, to prophetic visions, to communication with the dead. Rituals involving opium likely formed a core component of Minoan religious practice, allowing priests and priestesses to enter trance states, to receive oracles, to journey to other realms of existence, and return with wisdom for their people. On the Greek mainland, the relationship with opium was more complex, more ambivalent. The ancient Greeks, with their love of reason and moderation, their philosophical emphasis on self-control and balance, both celebrated and feared this powerful substance. Homer, the great blind poet whose epics would define Greek culture for millennia, speaks in the Odyssey of a mysterious drug called Nepenthe. The scene is memorable. Telemachus, son of Odysseus, sits grieving in the palace of Menelaus, overwhelmed by stories of his father's suffering and the losses of the Trojan War. Helen of Troy, that most famous of women, takes pity on him. She adds to his wine a substance, a pharmacon, that she had brought from Egypt, where the fertile earth produces countless drugs, some beneficial, some deadly. This drug, Homer tells us, banishes all pain and sorrow and brings forgetfulness of every evil. A man who drinks it will not shed a tear all day long, not even if his mother and father die, not even if his brother or beloved son is killed before his very eyes. For centuries, scholars have debated the identity of Nepenthe. What substance could possess such profound power over human emotion? The consensus among most historians and pharmacologists is that Homer was describing opium, most likely dissolved in wine, an opiate draught capable of producing exactly the effects he describes: profound analgesia, emotional numbing, the temporary erasure of grief and trauma. This passage is one of the earliest literary references to opium in Western literature, and it captures perfectly the substance's essential duality. It offers relief from unbearable suffering, yes, but at the cost of authentic human emotion, of genuine engagement with reality, however painful that reality might be. Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, who lived in the 4th century BCE, and whose influence on medical thinking cannot be overstated, approached opium with a physician's characteristic blend of respect and caution. Writing in his corpus of medical texts, he dismissed much of the magical and religious thinking that surrounded the poppy. For Hippocrates, opium was not a gift from the gods or a key to divine realms. It was a drug, a pharmacon in the Greek sense, a substance that could be either poison or medicine depending on the dose and the skill of the physician administering it. He catalogued its practical medical applications with clinical precision, as a hypnotic to induce sleep in patients tormented by insomnia, as a narcotic to dull severe pain, as a styptic to slow bleeding. He recommended it for internal diseases, whose exact nature we can only guess at from his descriptions, and for uterine ailments, recognizing that women suffering through difficult menstruation or complicated pregnancies could find genuine relief in carefully measured doses. Hippocrates was medicalizing opium, bringing it out of the temple and into the clinic, subjecting it to rational analysis rather than mystical reverence. But even as Greek physicians worked to demystify the substance, it retained its spiritual and mystical associations. Opium was almost certainly used in the Eleusinian mysteries, the most sacred and secretive religious rites in ancient Greece. These mysteries, dedicated to the goddesses Demeter and Persephone, promised initiates direct personal experience of the divine, a revelation so profound that those who underwent it were said to face death without fear. The exact nature of what happened during these rites was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the ancient world. Initiates swore oaths of silence under penalty of death, and remarkably, that secret was kept for over 1,000 years. No ancient source gives us a complete account of what transpired in the inner sanctum at Eleusis, but we know that participants consumed a ritual drink called the kykeon. Ancient sources describe it as a mixture of barley, water, and mint, but many modern scholars believe this mixture contained an additional ingredient, a mild dose of opium, possibly combined with other psychoactive plants. This would explain the profound visions and spiritual revelations that participants reported, experiences that transformed their understanding of life, death, and the cosmos. The Greeks understood, perhaps better than any civilization before or since, opium's fundamental duality. In the hands of a skilled physician like Hippocrates, it was a precise medical tool, no different in principle from a scalpel or a cauterizing iron. But in the hands of a priest conducting sacred mysteries, it became a key to unlock the doors of perception, to glimpse realities normally hidden from mortal eyes. Both uses were valid, both were valuable, and both carried risks. When Rome conquered Greece, absorbing its territories in a series of wars spanning the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, it inherited far more than land and tribute. Rome absorbed Greek culture wholesale, its gods barely bothering to change their names, its philosophy which would profoundly influence Roman thought, its art and architecture, and crucially for our story, its medical knowledge and pharmaceutical practices. The Romans, with their genius for organization, logistics and systematic exploitation of resources, took the cultivation, processing and trade of opium to an entirely new scale. What had been a valuable but relatively rare commodity became a staple of Roman life, available throughout the empire to anyone who could afford it. Opium was no longer a temple secret or a physician's carefully guarded remedy. It was a product, bought and sold in markets from Britannia to Syria, from Germania to Egypt. The great physician Galen of Pergamon, who lived in the 2nd century CE and served as personal physician to multiple Roman emperors, wrote more extensively about opium than any medical authority before him. His works would define medical understanding of the substance for the next 1500 years. Galen praised opium in terms that border on the ecstatic. He called it the most powerful of all remedies for dulling pain. He recommended it for an astonishing array of conditions as an antidote for poisons and venomous bites, for chronic headaches and vertigo, for deafness and epilepsy, for apoplexy and dimness of sight, for loss of voice and asthma, for colic and jaundice. The list goes on, encompassing nearly every malady known to Roman medicine. Galen perfected the creation of the riac, a legendary cure-all compound so complex that it contained dozens of ingredients and took months to prepare properly. The recipes varied, but opium was always the essential, indispensable component, the ingredient that gave the riac its legendary power. These elaborate opium-based medications were sold in apothecary shops throughout the empire, in every major city and many minor ones. Roman citizens from every social class, from senators in their marble villas to legionaries in their frontier camps, could purchase these remedies. They used them to ease the ailments that plagued everyone in the ancient world: joint pain and arthritis, chronic cough, insomnia, digestive complaints, the inevitable accumulation of small injuries and large worries that make human life difficult. Marcus Aurelius himself, the philosopher emperor, the Stoic sage who wrote the Meditations while campaigning on Rome's northern frontier, was a regular opium user. His personal physician administered it to him each evening as a draught mixed with wine, helping to soothe the chronic stomach pains and headaches that plagued him throughout his life. One wonders how much of Stoic philosophy's emphasis on tranquility in the face of suffering was influenced by the gentle numbness of an opium draught. Under Roman administration, the joy plant completed its first great transformation. It evolved from sacred flower to physician's tool to everyday commodity, from temple incense to imperial medicine to popular habit. The Romans established opium plantations in Asia Minor, in Egypt, in their North African provinces. They developed efficient processing techniques and reliable supply chains. They normalized its use to an extent that would not be seen again until the 19th century. Opium became woven into the fabric of Roman daily life, a comfort for the masses, a luxury for the elite, and a profitable business for merchants throughout the empire. But Rome, like all empires, was not eternal. In the 4th and 5th centuries CE, as barbarian tribes pressed against the frontiers and internal decay weakened the empire's foundations, the elaborate systems that had sustained Roman civilization began to collapse. When the Western Roman Empire finally fell, fragmenting into a patchwork of warring kingdoms, much was lost. The great libraries were scattered, burned, or simply left to rot, their precious contents destroyed by war, neglect, and the deliberate hostility of religious zealots who saw pagan learning as dangerous. The intricate medical wisdom preserved in the works of Hippocrates, Dioscorides and Galen became increasingly rare in Western Europe, surviving only as corrupted fragments in a few monastery libraries. The supply chains that had brought high-quality opium from Egypt and Asia Minor fell apart completely. Trade networks that had spanned the Mediterranean dissolved as piracy became rampant and political fragmentation made commerce dangerous and unpredictable. Western Europe entered what historians once called the Dark Ages, a period of cultural and scientific stagnation that would last for centuries. Medical knowledge regressed catastrophically, superstition replaced empiricism, prayer and pilgrimage became the primary responses to disease. The sophisticated pharmaceutical understanding of the Romans was largely forgotten. But this flame of classical knowledge was not extinguished, it was merely carried eastward, to a new and brilliant civilization rising from the deserts of Arabia. The Islamic Golden Age, spanning roughly from the 8th to the 14th centuries, became the guardian and curator of antiquity's accumulated wisdom, including everything the Greeks and Romans had learned about opium. In Baghdad, that magnificent jewel of the Abbasid Caliphate, a remarkable institution arose that would become legendary in the annals of human learning. The Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, established in the early 9th century CE, under the Caliph al-Ma'mun. This was far more than a library. It was a research institute, a translation academy, and a gathering place for the greatest minds of the age. Scholars from across the Islamic world and beyond, Arabs and Persians, Syriacs and Jews, Muslims and Christians and Zoroastrians, came together in this extraordinary cosmopolitan environment with a single shared purpose: to preserve, translate, and expand upon the knowledge of the ancients. A great translation movement was underway, perhaps the most important preservation effort in human history. Teams of scholars worked methodically through every Greek and Latin text they could acquire, translating the works of Hippocrates and Galen, of Aristotle and Plato, of Euclid and Ptolemy, into Arabic. They saved these texts from oblivion, preserving knowledge that would otherwise have been lost forever when the last Latin copies crumbled to dust in damp European monasteries. But these Islamic scholars did not merely preserve ancient wisdom, they interrogated it, tested it against empirical observation, refined it, corrected its errors, and expanded upon it in ways the Greeks and Romans could scarcely have imagined. Islamic physicians, with their advanced understanding of chemistry, botany, and human anatomy, subjected opium to rigorous scientific study. They were masters of pharmacology in a way that would not be matched in Europe for another 600 years. They understood dosing with precision, recognizing that the difference between medicine and poison was often a matter of a few grains more or less. They experimented with different preparations, different routes of administration, different combinations with other medicinal plants. Al-Kindi, the brilliant polymath, known as the philosopher of the Arabs, wrote extensive treatises on pharmaceutical compounds in the 9th century. His works included detailed discussions of opium, specifying the exact dosages required for different medical purposes, for analgesia, for inducing sleep, for suppressing cough, for treating diarrhea. He warned against excessive doses and described the symptoms of opium poisoning with clinical accuracy. This was pharmacology approaching the modern scientific standard, 1,000 years before modern pharmacology officially existed as a discipline. Rhazes, known in Arabic as Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi, was perhaps the greatest clinical physician of the Islamic Golden Age. Born in Persia in the mid-9th century, he served as chief physician at Baghdad's great hospital, where he treated patients from every social class and every corner of the known world. Rhazes pioneered the use of opium as a surgical anesthetic, developing a technique that represented a monumental advance in the history of medicine. He would prepare special sponges soaked in a carefully calibrated mixture of opium, henbane and mandrake root. Before surgery, these sponges would be placed over the patient's nose and mouth. The patient would inhale the vapors deeply, and within minutes would fall into a profound unnatural sleep, their muscles relaxed, their consciousness suspended. In this state, surgeons could perform procedures that would have been absolutely impossible on a conscious, screaming patient: the removal of bladder stones, the amputation of gangrenous limbs, the repair of hernias, even experimental surgeries to remove tumors or repair internal injuries. Patients would remember nothing of the ordeal. This was revolutionary. For the first time in human history, surgery could be performed without the patient suffering unimaginable agony, without strong men having to physically restrain a person writhing in pain, without the surgeon having to work with desperate, terrible speed before shock killed the patient. Rhazes documented his techniques meticulously in his medical writings, including exact recipes for the anesthetic sponges and detailed instructions for their use. This knowledge would eventually make its way back to Europe during the Crusades and the later Renaissance, helping to lay the groundwork for modern anesthesiology. But the most towering intellectual figure of this era, the man whose work would dominate medical thought and practice for the next 6 centuries, was Abu Ali al-Hussein ibn Sina, known to the Latin West as Avicenna. Born in Persia in 980 CE, Ibn Sina was a polymath of staggering genius. By the age of 18 he had mastered medicine, mathematics, physics, philosophy, and theology. By 21 he was writing original works that would influence scholars for centuries. His magnum opus, the Canon of Medicine, completed around 1025 CE, was an encyclopedic synthesis of all known medical knowledge, Greek, Roman, Persian, Indian, and the accumulated wisdom of Islamic physicians. The canon was organized with remarkable clarity and systematic rigor, covering anatomy, physiology, pathology, diagnosis, treatment, and pharmacology. It became the standard medical textbook throughout the Islamic world, and once translated into Latin in the 12th century, throughout Christian Europe as well. The canon was still being taught in European medical schools in the 17th century, 600 years after its composition. In the canon, Ibn Sina devoted considerable attention to opium, which he called al-Afon. He understood its properties with impressive precision. He recognized it as a powerful analgesic and sedative, but he also documented its dangers with a physician's caution. Ibn Sina described in clinical detail the symptoms of opium intoxication, the initial euphoria and sense of well-being, the subsequent drowsiness and mental clouding, the constriction of the pupils, the slowing of breath and heartbeat, the eventual stupor, if the dose was large enough. More significantly, he was among the first physicians to document clearly what we now call tolerance and dependence. He observed that patients who used opium regularly required increasingly large doses to achieve the same effect, that their bodies seemed to adapt to the drug's presence, demanding more and more to function normally. He noted that when regular users suddenly stopped taking opium, they experienced a constellation of distressing symptoms: restlessness and anxiety, profound muscle aches, cold sweats, nausea and vomiting, diarrhea, an inability to sleep despite desperate exhaustion. Ibn Sina recognized that these were not simply the return of the original ailment for which opium had been prescribed. These were new symptoms, caused by the absence of the drug itself. The body had become dependent. This was a crucial observation, a warning that opium's benefits came at a potential cost. Ibn Sina recommended using the lowest effective dose for the shortest necessary time, advice that remains valid to this day. The Islamic world's relationship with opium was not confined to medical contexts. In the great trading cities of the Caliphate, from Cordoba in the west to Samarkand in the east, opium was also used recreationally. Though this practice was more controversial, Islamic law prohibited the consumption of alcohol, but opium occupied a more ambiguous legal and religious space. Some Islamic jurists argued that opium was equally forbidden, an intoxicant that clouded the mind and prevented the faithful from properly performing their prayers. Others contended that opium was permissible when used for legitimate medical purposes, and that recreational use, while perhaps unwise, was not explicitly prohibited by the Quran or Hadith. This ambiguity created space for a culture of opium use to develop, particularly among the urban elite, the artists, poets, and intellectuals who gathered in the great cities. In the bathhouses and coffee houses, in private salons and palace gardens, educated men would gather to smoke opium mixed with tobacco, or to consume it dissolved in wine or sweet sherbets. These were not dens of depravity, but rather sophisticated social spaces, where philosophical discussions ranged freely, where poetry was recited and debated, where musicians performed. Opium was seen as an enhancement to these intellectual and aesthetic pleasures, a way to sharpen the appreciation of beauty, to loosen the tongue for eloquent speech, to induce states of contemplative introspection. Persian poetry of this era is filled with references to opium, often using it as a metaphor for divine intoxication, or the erasure of the self in mystical union with God. The great Sufi poets like Rumi and Hafiz, writing in the 13th and 14th centuries, employed the language of intoxication, of ecstatic self-loss, of surrender to overwhelming beauty. While much of this language was metaphorical, referring to spiritual states rather than literal drug use, the metaphors they chose reveal a culture intimately familiar with opium's effects. They understood from direct experience what it meant to lose oneself, to feel boundaries dissolve, to experience a kind of blissful annihilation of the ego. This was the state they sought through prayer, meditation, and mystical practice, but opium provided a shortcut, a chemical approximation of spiritual transcendence. The danger, which the more thoughtful Sufi masters recognized clearly, was that this chemical shortcut could become a substitute for genuine spiritual work, that the seeker might mistake the drug's effects for authentic enlightenment. As the Islamic Golden Age gradually waned, beginning in the 11th century with the invasions of the Seljuk Turks and culminating catastrophically in the 13th century with the Mongol destruction of Baghdad, the torch of learning began its slow journey back westward to Europe. The Crusades, those brutal and complex conflicts spanning the 11th through 13th centuries, brought European knights, merchants and scholars into direct contact with Islamic civilization. Many returned home with new ideas, new technologies, and new substances. Among these was opium, reintroduced to a Europe that had largely forgotten the sophisticated pharmaceutical knowledge of the Romans. Medical texts began to be translated from Arabic into Latin, including works by Rhazes, Avicenna, and other Islamic physicians. European doctors, reading these translations, rediscovered the medical potential of opium that their classical ancestors had known, but that had been lost during the chaos following Rome's fall. The medieval and early Renaissance periods in Europe saw opium's gradual reintegration into Western medical practice. Though knowledge remained limited and supply unreliable, opium had to be imported at great expense from the Middle East or from opium-producing regions around the Mediterranean. It was expensive, often adulterated, and available only to those wealthy enough to afford it, or fortunate enough to live in major cities with access to apothecaries. For most Europeans, opium remained exotic and mysterious, associated with the East, with luxury, with both healing and danger. The substance appeared in the increasingly elaborate preparations of medieval and Renaissance medicine. Theriac, that ancient Roman cure-all, was revived and became one of the most sought-after medicines in Europe. Its recipe, claimed to have been first perfected by Mithridates VI of Pontus in the 1st century BCE and refined by Galen, supposedly contained over 60 ingredients, including viper flesh, exotic spices, and of course, opium. Theriac was believed to be a universal antidote to poisons, a preventative against plague, and a general tonic for health. Wealthy Europeans consumed it regularly as a kind of insurance policy against the myriad dangers of medieval life. The preparation was so complex and required such rare ingredients that it could only be prepared by the most skilled apothecaries, often under official supervision to prevent fraud. In Venice, the preparation of the raiac was a public ceremony, conducted in the Piazza San Marco to assure customers of its authenticity. But perhaps the most significant development in Europe's relationship with opium came in the 16th century with the work of a brash, controversial Swiss-German physician named Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, who mercifully shortened his name to Paracelsus. Paracelsus was a revolutionary figure in the history of medicine, a man who rejected much of the ancient wisdom of Galen and Avicenna, insisting instead on direct observation, experimentation, and the development of new chemical medicines. He wandered across Europe, studying with miners and alchemists, learning from folk healers and midwives, gathering practical knowledge that the university-trained physicians of his day disdained. Paracelsus was particularly interested in developing powerful, purified medicines that could cure disease more effectively than the complex herbal mixtures that dominated medieval pharmacy. Among his creations was something he called laudanum, from the Latin word laudere, meaning to praise. Paracelsus's original laudanum was a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, combined with various other ingredients, whose exact composition he kept secret, as was common practice among alchemical physicians. He praised this preparation extravagantly, claiming it could cure nearly any disease, ease any pain, soothe any troubled mind. He carried a hollow pommel on his sword that allegedly contained laudanum, and he would dramatically offer doses to patients whom other doctors had given up as hopeless, sometimes achieving remarkable cures. Laudanum represented a significant advance in opium preparation. By dissolving opium in alcohol rather than water or wine, Paracelsus created a stable, potent preparation where the dose could be more precisely controlled. The alcohol extracted the active alkaloids from the raw opium more efficiently than water-based preparations, and it served as an effective preservative, allowing the medicine to be stored for long periods without degradation. Laudanum was easier to administer than raw opium, more palatable, and more reliable in its effects. It quickly became popular among those who could afford it, though Paracelsus' secretiveness about the exact recipe meant that many imitations appeared, of varying quality and potency. After Paracelsus's death in 1541, other physicians and apothecaries refined and modified his formula. The most successful and enduring version was developed in the 17th century by Thomas Sydenham, an English physician often called the English Hippocrates for his emphasis on careful clinical observation. Sydenham's laudanum, also called Sydenham's laudanum or tincture of opium, had a standardized recipe, opium dissolved in alcohol with the addition of saffron, cinnamon and cloves to improve the taste. This became the standard opium preparation in European and later American medicine, remaining in common use well into the 20th century. The 17th and 18th centuries saw opium use become increasingly common in Europe, no longer confined to the very wealthy or the seriously ill. As European colonial powers, particularly the Portuguese, Dutch and English, established trading networks across Asia, access to opium improved dramatically and prices fell. The substance became a standard item in the medicine chest of every respectable household. It was recommended for an astonishing array of complaints, pain of any kind certainly, but also insomnia, anxiety, melancholy, cough, diarrhea, dysentery, the symptoms of tuberculosis, the discomforts of old age, teething pain in infants, menstrual cramps, hysteria, that catch-all diagnosis for any emotional distress in women. Physicians prescribed it freely, with little understanding of its addictive potential and few concerns about long-term use. Medical literature of the period is filled with case studies of remarkable cures achieved through opium, with almost no mention of the dangers of dependence. The prevailing attitude was that opium was a gift from God, a miraculous medicine that could relieve suffering in ways nothing else could match. If some patients seemed to require it continuously, well, that merely proved they had chronic conditions requiring ongoing treatment. The concept of addiction as a disease, as something distinct from the original ailment being treated, had not yet fully formed in medical thinking. As European powers expanded their colonial reach in the 17th and 18th centuries, they encountered sophisticated cultures of opium use in Asia that dwarfed anything seen in Europe. In India, opium had been cultivated and consumed for millennia, though primarily for medicinal purposes and in religious contexts. The Mughal emperors had established state monopolies on opium production, recognizing its value both as medicine and as a source of revenue. Opium was given to soldiers before battle to make them fearless, to laborers to help them endure brutal working conditions, to the sick and dying for obvious reasons, and recreationally by those who could afford it, consumed in elaborate social rituals that bore some resemblance to European wine culture. But it was in China that European merchants would discover the most lucrative opium market in human history, and in exploiting that market, they would trigger events that would reshape the entire world. China in the 17th century was the world's largest and most sophisticated economy, with a population of over 100 million and cities that dwarfed anything in Europe. Chinese civilization looked upon European traders as barbarians from the edge of the world, useful only as a source of silver to trade for Chinese goods, silk, porcelain and above all tea, which was becoming an obsession in Europe. The problem for European merchants was that China wanted almost nothing that Europe produced. The trade was dramatically one-sided, with silver flowing steadily eastward to pay for Chinese goods, draining European treasuries. European merchants desperately needed something to sell to the Chinese, some product that would reverse this flow of precious metal. They found it in opium. The Portuguese had established the trading colony of Macau on China's southern coast in the 16th century, and they had brought with them the practice of smoking tobacco, a habit learned from the Americas. Enterprising individuals discovered that opium could be mixed with tobacco and smoked, or even smoked pure in specially designed pipes. This method of consumption was far more potent than eating opium, delivering the drug to the brain in seconds via the lungs, producing an intense immediate effect followed by a profound sense of relaxation and well-being. Opium smoking was unlike anything previously known in China. While the Chinese had used opium medicinally for centuries, calling it the foreign medicine because it was originally imported from Arab lands, recreational use had been limited. Smoking changed everything. It transformed opium from a medicine used occasionally by the sick into a recreational drug that could be enjoyed regularly by anyone seeking pleasure or escape. By the late 17th century, opium smoking had become a noticeable social problem in Chinese coastal cities, sufficiently concerning that in 1729, the Qing Emperor Yongzheng issued the first imperial edict, prohibiting the sale and consumption of opium for non-medical purposes. This edict marked the beginning of more than a century of escalating conflict between Chinese authorities trying to control opium use and European, primarily British, merchants determined to expand the lucrative opium trade. The British East India Company, that remarkable instrument of British imperial power that operated as both commercial enterprise and quasi-government, saw the opportunity clearly. Company officials in India realized they could grow opium on an industrial scale in India, particularly in the Bengal region, and sell it in China for spectacular profits. The opium could be purchased from Indian farmers for relatively little, transported by ship to China, and sold for many times the purchase price. Chinese silver would flow back to India, and ultimately to Britain, finally reversing the trade imbalance that had plagued European merchants for 2 centuries. This was the economic logic that would drive Britain to become the world's largest drug trafficker, a distinction that seems almost unbelievable given Britain's later role as a champion of international drug control. The East India Company established a sophisticated system for opium production in India. They provided seeds and credit to farmers, particularly in Bihar and Bengal, essentially requiring them to grow opium poppies. After harvest, farmers would sell the raw opium to the company at fixed prices. The opium would then be processed at company factories, formed into balls or cakes, carefully packaged, and stamped with the company's mark of quality. This industrialization of opium production was unprecedented in scale. By the early 19th century, the East India Company was overseeing the cultivation of opium across hundreds of thousands of acres, processing thousands of tons of opium annually. Special swift ships called opium clippers were designed specifically for the trade, built for speed to deliver the valuable cargo quickly, and to outrun pirates or Chinese patrol vessels. The opium was transported to coastal China, where it was sold at auction to private merchants, technically independent of the East India Company, but effectively operating as its agents. These merchants would then smuggle the opium into China proper, bribing officials, paying off local warlords, distributing it through networks of smaller dealers who ran opium dens in cities and villages across southern China. The Chinese government's attempts to stop this trade grew increasingly desperate as the scale of the problem became apparent. Opium addiction was spreading through all levels of Chinese society. It was no longer confined to coastal cities, or to the wealthy who could afford the expensive import. Opium dens proliferated in every city and town, from sophisticated establishments catering to wealthy merchants to squalid rooms in slums where laborers would spend their meager wages on a few hours of oblivion. Estimates from the early 19th century suggest that by the 1830s, several million Chinese were regular opium users, consuming tons of the drug annually. This represented a staggering public health crisis, but also an economic catastrophe. The flow of silver out of China to pay for opium was so massive that it was destabilizing the Chinese economy, causing deflation and economic hardship. Moreover, opium addiction was affecting the efficiency of government bureaucrats, the effectiveness of soldiers in the army, the productivity of workers in fields and workshops. It was a crisis that threatened the very foundations of Chinese society and the Qing dynasty's stability. In 1839, the Qing emperor appointed a rigid, incorruptible official named Lin Zixu as imperial commissioner, with extraordinary powers to end the opium trade once and for all. Lin Zixu arrived in Canton, the main port through which opium entered China, and took dramatic action. He surrounded the foreign trading factories, the compounds where European merchants lived and conducted business, and demanded they surrender all opium in their possession. When the merchants hesitated, he threatened to execute Chinese opium dealers and cut off all trade. Lin Zixu was not a man to be intimidated. The British merchants, accustomed to bribing their way out of difficulties, to negotiating compromises, to finding loopholes in regulations, discovered they were dealing with someone entirely different. Lin Zixu was a Confucian scholar official of the old school, a man who believed absolutely in the righteousness of his emperor's commands, and in his own moral duty to execute them without compromise. He composed a letter to Queen Victoria herself, an extraordinary document that reveals the vast cultural gulf between China and Britain. In this letter, translated and sent through diplomatic channels, Lin Zixu appealed to Victoria's conscience and sense of justice. He wrote that China produced tea, silk, and rhubarb, beneficial products that Britain desired and purchased freely. But Britain, he noted, sent to China only one product: poison, a substance that destroyed lives, ruined families, weakened the nation. He asked how Britain could justify this trade. Would Britain permit another nation to import opium into England and addict the British people? Of course not. Then by what moral logic could Britain continue to poison China? The letter was eloquent, reasonable, and utterly ignored. There is no evidence Queen Victoria ever read it, and if she did, she certainly never replied. The British government's position was simple: free trade. They argued that the Chinese government had no right to prohibit what British merchants chose to sell, and Chinese consumers chose to buy. This was of course a remarkably convenient principle that Britain would abandon immediately whenever it suited their interests. but in 1839 free trade was the banner under which the opium merchants operated. When the British merchants in Canton finally surrendered their opium to Lin Zexu, the quantities were staggering. Over 20,000 chests of opium, each chest containing roughly 60 kilograms of the drug, were handed over. That represented over 1,000 tons of opium, with a street value that would run into many millions of pounds sterling. Lin Zexu had this enormous quantity transported to the beaches near Canton, where, in a meticulously organized operation that took weeks to complete, it was destroyed. Workers dug large trenches near the water's edge, mixed the opium with salt and lime to neutralize it, and then flushed it into the ocean with the tide. This was not done secretly or shamefully. Lin Zexu made it a public ceremony, a demonstration of Chinese resolve and moral righteousness. He performed elaborate rituals, offering prayers to the sea god Tin Hal, apologizing for polluting the ocean but explaining the necessity. Crowds gathered to watch this unprecedented spectacle, the destruction of such valuable contraband on the orders of the emperor himself. Lin Zexu believed this dramatic action would finally convince the foreign merchants that China was serious, but the opium trade was over. He could not have been more wrong. In London, when news of the destruction reached British officials and merchants, the reaction was not shame or acquiescence but outrage. The British government, under pressure from merchants who had lost their valuable opium, from investors who held shares in the opium trade, and from politicians who saw an opportunity to force China to open its markets more fully, made a decision that would have profound consequences. They would go to war. The justifications offered to the British public were carefully crafted to obscure the real issue. This was not presented as a war to force China to accept opium imports, though that was exactly what it was. Instead, it was framed as a matter of principle, of national honor, of protecting British subjects from arbitrary foreign tyranny. The Chinese, it was argued, had illegally seized British property without compensation. They had imprisoned British merchants, threatening their lives. They had insulted the British flag and refused to deal with Britain as an equal sovereign nation. British military action was therefore defensive, a necessary response to Chinese aggression, a mission to uphold international law and the rights of free trade. These arguments were debated vigorously in Parliament. A young member of Parliament named William Gladstone, who would later serve as Prime Minister, spoke passionately against the war, calling it unjust and immoral, a war to force a poisonous drug on an unwilling population. But his eloquent opposition was not enough. The vote authorizing military action passed, though narrowly. Britain would send warships and troops to China, not to conquer the vast country, which would have been impossible, but to apply overwhelming force at strategic points until the Chinese government capitulated and agreed to British demands. This was the First Opium War, lasting from 1839 to 1842, a conflict that was barely a war in the conventional sense. It was more accurately a systematic demonstration of European military superiority over traditional Asian forces. The Qing military forces, designed to suppress internal rebellions and to fight land wars against nomadic tribes on China's northern and western frontiers, were utterly unprepared for what they faced. British warships, products of the Industrial Revolution, were faster, more maneuverable, and far more heavily armed than anything in the Chinese arsenal. Chinese war junks, propelled by sails and oars, built of wood and armed with antiquated cannons, were blown apart by British naval guns before they could get close enough to return fire effectively. British steam-powered gunboats, able to move upriver against wind and current, penetrated deep into Chinese territory, bombarding coastal forts and cities with impunity. British infantry, equipped with modern rifles and supported by artillery, repeatedly defeated much larger Chinese forces armed with matchlock muskets, swords and spears. The technological gap was so vast that many battles were less contests than massacres. At the Battle of Canton in 1841, a British force of fewer than 3,000 troops defeated a Chinese army of over 10,000, capturing the city with minimal British casualties while inflicting thousands of deaths on the Chinese. This pattern repeated itself throughout the war. British forces would bombard a coastal city or fort into submission, extract concessions or tribute, then move on to the next target, slowly working their way up the coast toward the mouth of the Yangtze River, China's great commercial artery. The Qing court in Beijing, initially confident that the barbarian incursion would be quickly suppressed, grew increasingly alarmed as reports came in of defeat after defeat. The emperor dismissed Lin Zexu, blaming him for provoking the crisis. He sent various officials to negotiate with the British, but each discovered that British demands only increased with each military victory. Finally, with British ships threatening to sail up the Yangtze and potentially cut off Beijing from southern China, the Qing government capitulated. The Treaty of Nanking, signed in August 1842 aboard a British warship, was the first of what Chinese historians call the unequal treaties, agreements forced upon China by foreign powers under the threat of military destruction. The terms were humiliating and devastating for China. The island of Hong Kong was ceded to Britain in perpetuity, becoming a British colony and a base for British power in East Asia. 5 Chinese ports, including Canton and Shanghai, were designated as treaty ports that must be open to British merchants, with British citizens in these ports subject to British rather than Chinese law. This principle, called extraterritoriality, meant that British subjects could not be tried in Chinese courts, creating a system of legal immunity that the Chinese saw as a profound insult to their sovereignty. China was required to pay a massive indemnity of 21 million silver dollars to compensate Britain for the destroyed opium, for the costs of the war, and for debts Chinese merchants supposedly owed to British merchants. And crucially, though it was not explicitly stated in the treaty itself, China was forced to accept continued opium imports. The drug that had caused the entire crisis would continue to flow into China in ever-increasing quantities. The Treaty of Nanking was just the beginning. Other Western powers, seeing China's weakness exposed, rushed to demand their own treaties on similar terms. The Americans arrived with warships and demands for treaty ports and trade rights. The French did the same. Even smaller European nations got into the act, each extracting concessions. China, which for centuries had seen itself as the Middle Kingdom, the center of civilization to which barbarian peoples came as supplicants bearing tribute, was being systematically dismembered and humiliated. The psychological and political shock was profound. The Qing dynasty's mandate of heaven, its legitimacy in the eyes of its people, was based on its ability to protect China and maintain order. That legitimacy was now in question. Internal rebellions, which had been simmering for years, began to boil over. The Taiping Rebellion, which erupted in 1850, was the most catastrophic civil war of the 19th century, lasting 14 years, and resulting in the deaths of an estimated 20 to 30 million people, far more than would die in the American Civil War, or any European conflict of the era. While the Taiping Rebellion had complex causes rooted in social, economic and religious tensions, the Qing dynasty's weakness and loss of prestige following the Opium War was a significant contributing factor. China was unraveling, and opium was one of the threads being pulled, but Britain and the other Western powers were not satisfied with the Treaty of Nanking. They wanted more access to Chinese markets, more treaty ports, the right to travel in the interior, the legalization of the opium trade which remained officially prohibited even if it was openly tolerated. And they wanted the Chinese government to formally accept diplomatic relations on equal terms rather than treating foreign envoys as bearers of tribute from inferior nations. When China resisted these additional demands, incidents were manufactured or exploited as pretexts for further military action. In 1856, Chinese officials boarded a Chinese-owned ship, the Arrow, which was registered in Hong Kong and therefore flew the British flag, and arrested several crew members suspected of piracy and smuggling. The British claimed this was an insult to the British flag, and demanded an apology and compensation. When China refused to apologize in sufficiently humiliating terms, Britain decided on war. France, eager for its own share of Chinese concessions and using the murder of a French missionary as its pretext, joined Britain in what became known as the Second Opium War, also called the Arrow War, lasting from 1856 to 1860. This second conflict was even more one-sided than the first. British and French forces, this time with explicit governmental backing rather than operating through the fiction of merchant protection, attacked Chinese positions with systematic efficiency. They captured Canton and occupied it for several years. They sailed north and captured the Taku forts that guarded the approach to Tianjin and Beijing. When Chinese negotiators agreed to terms and then reneged, claiming the emperor had not authorized the concessions, the Allied forces responded with overwhelming violence. In 1860, a British and French army marched on Beijing itself. The Qing emperor fled the capital to his summer retreat. The Allied forces, meeting minimal resistance, occupied Beijing and embarked on what can only be described as an act of cultural vandalism that shocked even many of their contemporaries. The Old Summer Palace, the Yuan Ming Yuan, was a vast complex of palaces, temples, gardens, and pavilions that had been constructed over more than a century, a masterpiece of Chinese architecture and landscape design. filled with priceless artworks, historical documents, and cultural treasures. British and French soldiers looted it systematically, carrying off or destroying everything of value. Then, on orders from Lord Elgin, the British commander, they burned the entire complex to the ground. The fire burned for days, reducing centuries of cultural heritage to ash and ruins. This act was not military necessity. It was collective punishment, a deliberate infliction of pain intended to humiliate the Chinese court and demonstrate that resistance to Western demands was futile. The Treaty of Tianjin, which ended the Second Opium War, imposed even harsher terms than the Treaty of Nanking. 10 more treaty ports were opened. Foreign merchants and missionaries were granted the right to travel throughout China's interior, no longer confined to the coastal trading posts. The opium trade was explicitly legalized and subject to a tariff, meaning the Chinese government now officially sanctioned and taxed the importation of the drug that was destroying its people. Foreign powers were granted the right to station diplomats permanently in Beijing, a profound change from the traditional Chinese system where foreign envoys were received only temporarily. The indemnity payments were increased, and in a particularly galling provision, China was forced to apologize for its resistance and for the inconvenience it had caused the foreign powers in having to send their armies and navies to enforce their demands. The Second Opium War marked the nadir of Chinese sovereignty in the 19th century. The nation that had been the world's most advanced civilization, the inventor of paper, printing, gunpowder, and the compass, the culture that had given the world sophisticated philosophy, exquisite art, and complex bureaucratic government, was being treated as a semi-colonial possession to be exploited at will by foreign powers whose representatives regarded Chinese people as racially and culturally inferior. The opium trade, now fully legalized and operating under official tariffs, exploded in scale. By the 1870s, China was importing well over 6,000 tons of opium annually, nearly all of it produced in British India, under the supervision of the East India Company and its successor, the British Raj, after the company was dissolved, following the Indian Rebellion of 1857. But even this massive importation was not enough to meet Chinese demand. Chinese farmers, seeing the profits to be made, began growing opium poppies themselves, particularly in the southwestern provinces of Yunnan and Sichuan, where the climate was suitable. By the late 19th century, domestic Chinese opium production exceeded imports, meaning that the total amount of opium being consumed in China was staggering, perhaps 10,000 tons or more annually. Estimates of the number of Chinese opium addicts vary widely, but by the end of the century, the figure was certainly in the tens of millions, possibly approaching 10% of the entire adult male population. This was a public health catastrophe, without precedent in human history, a nation-level addiction crisis, deliberately created and sustained by foreign commercial interests, backed by military force. The effects of this mass addiction on Chinese society were devastating and multifaceted. At the individual level, chronic opium use caused the predictable physical deterioration, weight loss, weakened immune system, chronic constipation, dental problems, reduced sexual function, cognitive impairment. Addicts often became unable to work regularly, their lives revolving around obtaining and consuming the drug. But the social effects were even more destructive. Families were ruined financially, as the primary breadwinner spent all available income on opium. Women and children were sometimes sold into servitude or prostitution to pay for a father's or husband's addiction. Opium dens, which ranged from relatively respectable establishments to absolute hovels, became ubiquitous in Chinese cities and towns. They were places of escape, certainly, where laborers could forget the grinding poverty of their lives, where merchants could relax after business, where scholars could seek inspiration or simply oblivion. But they were also places of despair, filled with hollow-eyed men lying on wooden benches in darkened rooms, drawing deeply on long opium pipes, drifting in and out of consciousness, hour after hour, day after day, until their money ran out, and they were ejected back into the harsh light of reality. The economic impact was equally severe. The silver that flowed out of China to pay for imported opium continued to destabilize the economy throughout the century. But perhaps even more significant was the loss of productivity. Millions of men in their prime working years were partially or completely incapacitated by addiction. Fields went untended, workshops operated below capacity, shops closed, bureaucrats grew lazy and corrupt, soldiers became ineffective. The Qing military forces, already demonstrated to be technologically inferior to Western armies, were further weakened by opium addiction among both officers and enlisted men. Attempts to reform and modernize the military were hampered by the fact that many of the troops being trained were opium addicts unable to sustain the physical demands of modern military service. The tax base shrank as economic activity declined, and as opium smuggling, tax evasion, and official corruption siphoned revenue away from the imperial treasury. The Qing government, facing multiple internal rebellions and constant external threats from foreign powers, desperately needed revenue for military modernization and internal development. Instead, it was hemorrhaging silver to pay foreign debts and indemnities, while its own tax collection became increasingly inefficient. The Chinese government made various attempts to control the opium epidemic, but these efforts were undermined by several factors. First, local officials were often corrupt, accepting bribes from opium dealers and even participating in the trade themselves. An official who tried to enforce anti-opium laws rigorously might find himself opposed by other officials who were profiting from the trade. Second, the Qing government itself was profoundly ambivalent about opium. While recognizing it as a social evil, the government was also collecting substantial tariff revenue from legal opium imports and from taxes on domestic opium production. Shutting down the opium trade would mean losing this revenue stream at a time when the government was desperately short of funds. Third, and perhaps most fundamentally, attempting to suppress opium use was extraordinarily difficult in practical terms. With millions of addicts dependent on the drug, any sudden prohibition would cause immense suffering and potential social unrest. The government feared that opium addicts, if suddenly denied access to the drug, might riot or rebel, so prohibition efforts tended to be half-hearted and sporadic, targeting the most visible manifestations of the trade while allowing it to continue underneath. Official policy zigzagged between attempted suppression and de facto tolerance, with neither approach proving effective. By the late 19th century, some Chinese reformers and intellectuals had begun to argue that the opium problem could only be solved through a comprehensive approach, combining gradual reduction of supply, treatment and rehabilitation for addicts, and most importantly, addressing the underlying social and economic problems that made so many Chinese turn to opium for escape. Poverty, overcrowding, lack of opportunity, political instability, these were the conditions that created a population vulnerable to addiction. Simply trying to cut off the supply without addressing these root causes was futile, but implementing such comprehensive reforms would have required a strong, stable, competent government, and by the end of the 19th century, the Qing dynasty was none of these things. It was a hollow shell nominally governing China, but in reality presiding over its dismemberment. Large parts of the country were under foreign control or influence. The economy was dominated by foreign merchants and banks. The government was so indebted to foreign powers that its customs revenues were controlled by foreign administrators to ensure debt payments. Internal rebellions continued to flare up. The dynasty's days were clearly numbered, and when it finally fell in 1911, bringing to an end over 2,000 years of imperial rule in China, the opium epidemic was among the many catastrophic failures that had destroyed its legitimacy. The Western powers that had forced opium on China faced no such domestic crisis, but they were not immune to opium's effects. Throughout the 19th century, while Britain was waging war to keep Chinese ports open to opium, British citizens back home were consuming opium in unprecedented quantities. This was not hypocrisy exactly, because the patterns of use were quite different. In Britain and other Western countries, opium was consumed primarily in the form of laudanum, that tincture of opium in alcohol that had been developed by Paracelsus and refined by Thomas Sydenham. Laudanum was a completely legal, socially acceptable medicine, available without prescription from any apothecary or general store. It was cheap enough that even working-class families could afford it, and it was recommended by doctors for such a wide range of ailments that it seemed almost everyone had a legitimate reason to use it. Women in particular were heavy users of laudanum. Victorian medicine viewed women as inherently delicate, prone to nervous disorders, hysteria, melancholy, and various vague complaints that were probably as much social as medical in origin. For all these conditions, and for the perfectly real discomforts of menstruation, pregnancy, and menopause, doctors prescribed laudanum freely. Middle-class and upper-class women who would never dream of visiting an opium den, who would have been horrified at the suggestion that they had anything in common with Chinese opium addicts, nevertheless consumed significant quantities of opium daily in their medicine. Victorian mothers routinely gave opium preparations to their infants and small children. Teething powders, cough syrups, and remedies for colic almost invariably contained opium, often in surprisingly high doses. Products with reassuring names like Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, Godfrey's Cordial, and Atkinson's Infant Preservative were opium preparations marketed specifically for children. The advertising for these products emphasized how effectively they quieted crying babies, helping them sleep through the night, giving exhausted mothers much-needed rest. What the advertising did not mention, because the manufacturers either did not know or chose to ignore, was that these products were creating opiate dependence in infants. Babies given these preparations regularly would become addicted, experiencing withdrawal symptoms if the doses were stopped, symptoms that the parents would interpret as illness requiring more medicine, thus perpetuating the cycle. The infant mortality rate in Victorian Britain was horrifyingly high by modern standards, and while the majority of deaths were due to infectious diseases and malnutrition, a significant number were almost certainly caused or contributed to by opiate poisoning. Babies would be given too large a dose, their breathing would slow and eventually stop, and death would be attributed to natural causes, to some mysterious infant ailment, when in fact it was iatrogenic, caused by medicine. Working-class families used opium for grimly practical reasons. In the industrial cities of Victorian England, life for the poor was brutal. Adults worked 12 or 14-hour days in factories, mines and workshops under conditions that were dangerous, exhausting and soul-destroying. Children as young as 5 or 6 worked similar hours in textile mills or coal mines. Everyone suffered from malnutrition, inadequate housing, lack of sanitation, and the constant threat of injury, illness, and unemployment. In such circumstances, opium offered a cheap escape. A bottle of laudanum cost less than a pint of gin, and lasted longer. Workers would dose themselves before their shifts to dull the pain of injuries and make the grueling labor more bearable. They would dose themselves after work, to ease aching muscles and help them sleep, despite the noise, cold and discomfort of their overcrowded tenements. Women working in the textile mills of the industrial north consumed enormous quantities of laudanum, so much that contemporary observers noted it as a regional characteristic. The drug helped them endure the deafening noise, the choking cotton dust, the monotonous repetition of tending machines for 12 hours straight. It suppressed appetite, which was useful when food was scarce. It provided a few hours of relief from lives that offered almost nothing else. The scale of British opium consumption in the Victorian era is difficult to establish precisely because there were no controls on sales and therefore no systematic records. But we can make reasonable estimates from import figures and production records. In 1827, Britain imported approximately 17,000 pounds of opium for domestic consumption. By 1859, that figure had risen to 61,000 pounds. By 1868, to 112,000 pounds, and this takes no account of opium-containing patent medicines that were manufactured domestically, and whose exact opium content was a closely guarded trade secret. Adjusting for population, the British were consuming opium at rates that were remarkable, though still far below the catastrophic levels seen in China. The difference was primarily in the method of consumption. The British ate or drank their opium in carefully measured doses, or what they believed were carefully measured doses, since the actual opium content of laudanum and patent medicines varied considerably. The Chinese, by contrast, were smoking opium, which delivered a more intense immediate effect and seemed to produce more severe addiction patterns. Nevertheless, Britain in the 19th century was a nation deeply dependent on opium, even as it condemned China for the same dependence. The professional and educated classes were not exempt from opium use. On the contrary, many of the most prominent figures of Victorian culture were regular opium users, some of whom wrote eloquently about their experiences. Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater, published in 1821, was a sensation, a best-selling memoir that introduced many readers to the heights of pleasure and depths of torment that opium could produce. De Quincey began using laudanum as a student at Oxford to relieve the pain of a toothache and neuralgia. He quickly discovered that opium did far more than simply relieve pain. It produced, he wrote, a state of divine enjoyment, an expansion of consciousness, an intensification of all pleasures. Music became more beautiful, literature more profound, ideas more crystalline. He felt he had discovered the key to happiness itself, but as his use continued over years, the pleasures diminished while the pains increased. He found he could not function without opium, that even routine daily activities became impossible unless he was under the drug's influence. Worse, he began experiencing what he called the pains of opium, terrible nightmares that haunted him even during waking hours, visions of infinite suffering, of being buried alive, of time stretching out endlessly in agonized consciousness. These were almost certainly symptoms of what we now recognize as opiate withdrawal, though De Quincey did not understand this. He described his attempts to reduce or quit his opium use as Herculean struggles that inevitably ended in failure and relapse. His Confessions was both a cautionary tale, and paradoxically, an advertisement for opium's pleasures that probably inspired as many people to begin using as it deterred. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the great Romantic poet, was another famous opium addict. He began using laudanum for legitimate medical reasons, treating rheumatic pain and dysentery, but quickly became dependent. His addiction may have fueled some of his most famous creative work. The poem Kubla Khan was supposedly composed in an opium dream, a vision that came to him complete and perfect while he dozed under the drug's influence, though he was able to write down only a fragment before the vision faded. But opium also destroyed much of Coleridge's potential. He became unable to complete projects, unable to fulfill commitments, unable to maintain relationships. He spent the later decades of his life in a fog of opium-induced lethargy, dependent on the charity of friends, producing far less than his early promise suggested he might. Other literary figures of the 19th century who used opium regularly included Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who began taking laudanum for a spinal injury, and continued for decades, Charles Dickens, who used it for insomnia and various ailments, Wilkie Collins, who consumed enormous quantities of laudanum to treat gout, and George Eliot, who used it medicinally but cautiously. The list could go on. Opium was so commonplace in Victorian Britain that it would have been more remarkable for a prominent person not to have used it at some point. For the creative class, it was often seen as a tool for inspiration, a way to access deeper layers of consciousness, to break free from conventional thinking, to experience the world with heightened intensity. This romantic mythology around opium and creativity would persist well into the 20th century, and continues to some extent even today in attitudes toward drugs and artistic production. Across the Atlantic, the United States was developing its own complex relationship with opium. Americans in the early 19th century consumed opium at rates comparable to the British, and for similar reasons. Laudanum and other opium preparations were standard items in American medicine cabinets. Patent medicines containing opium proliferated, marketed with extravagant claims and virtually no regulation. The Sears Roebuck catalog, that iconic representation of American consumer culture, offered numerous opium-containing products by mail order, shipped directly to customers across the country with no questions asked. These medicines were used to treat genuine ailments, certainly, but also to self-medicate for the stresses and disappointments of life. Americans in the 19th century faced many of the same challenges as the British, a rapidly industrializing economy that created vast wealth for some and grinding poverty for many, social dislocation as people moved from farms to cities, lack of social safety nets, inadequate medical care for most. Opium offered an affordable coping mechanism, but the United States also had a unique historical experience with opium that would shape its later attitudes: the American Civil War. This catastrophic conflict, lasting from 1861 to 1865 and resulting in over 600,000 military deaths, created the nation's first large-scale addiction crisis. The war was fought at a time when military medicine was primitive. Anesthesia existed, but was not always available at field hospitals. Surgical techniques were crude. Antisepsis was not yet understood, so infection rates were horrific, and the most common treatment for wounded soldiers was amputation, performed quickly, often without adequate anesthesia, to prevent gangrene from spreading. Opium was issued to Union and Confederate forces in enormous quantities. It was the only effective pain medication available, and it was used liberally. Soldiers wounded in battle would be given opium to ease their suffering. Those undergoing surgery would be given larger doses to render them unconscious, or at least insensible to pain. Those recovering from wounds or illness would be given opium to help them sleep and to suppress the dysentery that was often more deadly than combat. Medical officers dispensed opium with little concern for long-term consequences, because immediate survival was the priority, and because the medical understanding of addiction was still primitive. The result was that tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of soldiers returned from the war physically dependent on opium. They had been given it regularly for months or years, Their bodies had adapted to its presence, and they could not simply stop using it without experiencing severe withdrawal. Many veterans continued to use opium for the rest of their lives, requiring it daily just to feel normal, to avoid the sweating, shaking, pain and anxiety of withdrawal. This phenomenon became so common that it acquired a name, the soldier's disease, sometimes called the army disease. It was the first widely recognized addiction epidemic in American history, and it created a population of opioid-dependent veterans numbering in the hundreds of thousands. These veterans were not criminals or moral failures. They were men who had served their country, who had suffered terrible wounds, who had sacrificed their health and often their limbs in military service. Yet they found themselves dependent on a substance that was beginning to acquire a social stigma, particularly when used in ways other than as prescribed medicine. The pattern of their use also differed from typical laudanum consumption. Many Civil War veterans had been introduced to morphine, the primary alkaloid of opium that had been isolated in pure form in the early 19th century by a German pharmacist named Friedrich Saturner. Morphine was far more potent than opium, requiring much smaller doses to achieve the same effect, and it could be administered by injection, a method that delivered the drug to the brain almost instantly, producing a rush of euphoria followed by profound relief from pain and anxiety. The hypodermic needle, invented in the 1850s, was first widely used during the American Civil War, and it revolutionized both medicine and drug use. Injecting morphine was more effective for treating acute pain than oral administration, and military surgeons used the technique extensively. But it also produced more powerful addiction. Soldiers learned to inject themselves, and many continued doing so after the war. This was a new pattern of opiate use, more intensive and more problematic than the traditional oral consumption of laudanum or opium. The post-war decades saw increasing concern about opiate addiction in America, but the response was fragmented and often counterproductive. Some states began passing laws attempting to regulate or prohibit opiate sales without prescription, but these laws were easily circumvented. Patent medicines, because they were proprietary formulations, were exempted from most regulations. Morphine could be purchased by mail order from pharmaceutical supply companies, and doctors continued to prescribe opiates freely for a wide range of complaints, often creating new addicts while treating the old ones. There was also significant confusion about what addiction actually was. Some medical authorities believed that addiction resulted from moral weakness, that strong-willed individuals could use opiates without becoming dependent while weak-willed individuals could not. This moralizing approach blamed the victim, and provided no useful framework for treatment. Other authorities believed addiction was a disease, but disagreed about whether it was curable or permanent, whether treatment should involve gradual reduction of dose or sudden cessation, whether the addict should be isolated from society, or treated within their community. There was no consensus, no standard treatment protocol, and most importantly, no effective treatment. Addicts who wanted to quit faced an agonizing choice: endure the torment of withdrawal, which could last weeks and felt unbearable, or continue using and accept a life of dependency. Into this confused landscape stepped a development that initially seemed like a medical breakthrough, but would prove to be a catastrophe. In 1874, a British chemist named C.R. Alder Wright, experimenting with modifications to the morphine molecule, created diacetyl morphine by boiling morphine with acetic anhydride. This new compound sat in laboratories for years, largely ignored, until 1897, when the German pharmaceutical company Bayer began investigating it systematically. Bayer's chemists, led by Heinrich Dresser, found that diacetyl morphine was a highly effective cough suppressant and pain reliever, apparently more effective than morphine itself. In animal studies, it seemed to produce less respiratory depression, one of morphine's most dangerous side effects. Most remarkably, early human trials suggested that diacetyl morphine might be non-addictive, or at least less addictive than morphine. This seemed to be the holy grail of pain medicine, a powerful analgesic, without the terrible problem of dependency. In 1898, Bayer launched this new drug commercially with a name that reflected the heroic, powerful feelings it produced in users: heroin. It was marketed as a cough suppressant and a treatment for morphine addiction. The advertising was aggressive and confident. Heroin was safe, effective, and suitable for children, according to Bayer's promotional materials. It was recommended for coughs, colds, bronchitis, asthma, and tuberculosis. And crucially, it was promoted as a cure for morphine addiction, a way for morphine addicts to transition to a supposedly safer drug. Doctors prescribed it enthusiastically. Patients reported remarkable results. Heroin seemed to be everything that had been promised. Within a few years, however, the terrible truth became apparent. Heroin was not non-addictive, it was ferociously addictive. far more so than morphine. The reason it had seemed less problematic in early trials was that it hadn't been used long enough for physical dependence to develop. Once someone used heroin regularly for a few weeks, they became as dependent as any morphine addict, and often more so. Worse, because heroin was more potent than morphine, because it crossed the blood-brain barrier more quickly, producing a more intense rush. It seemed to produce more powerful cravings and more devastating addiction. The morphine addicts who had been prescribed heroin as a cure found themselves addicted to a new, more powerful drug. They were worse off than before, and a new population of heroin addicts was being created among people who had never used morphine, people who had started taking heroin for a cough or for pain and found themselves unable to stop. By the early 1900s, heroin addiction was recognized as a severe problem, particularly in American cities. Bayer quietly withdrew heroin from sale in 1913. But by then enormous quantities had been distributed, and other pharmaceutical companies were manufacturing it. The heroin genie was out of the bottle, and would never be put back. As heroin addiction grew in the early 20th century, it intersected with other social forces to create a moral panic about drugs that would fundamentally reshape American, and later international drug policy. One factor was racism and xenophobia. Opium smoking, as distinct from the oral consumption of laudanum or the injection of morphine, had been brought to America by Chinese immigrants who came to work on the railroads and in the mines during the mid-19th century. These Chinese immigrants established communities in western cities, particularly San Francisco, and they brought with them the custom of smoking opium in communal settings. Opium dens operated openly in Chinatowns across the American West, serving primarily Chinese customers. White Americans generally regarded these establishments with a mixture of fascination and disgust, seeing them as exotic, alien, and morally suspect. As long as opium smoking remained confined to Chinese communities, most white Americans were content to ignore it or to view it as a vice peculiar to an inferior race. But as economic conditions worsened in the late 19th century, Chinese immigrants became scapegoats for white workers' frustrations. They were accused of taking jobs, of working for lower wages, of being willing to live in conditions that white workers would not tolerate. Anti-Chinese sentiment became virulent, leading to violence, discriminatory laws, and eventually to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which prohibited Chinese immigration to the United States for decades. Opium smoking became entangled with this anti-Chinese racism. Sensationalistic newspaper articles claimed that Chinese men were luring white women into opium dens, where they would become addicted and then fall into prostitution or other forms of degradation. These stories, largely fictional or wildly exaggerated, played on deep-seated racial and sexual anxieties. The image of the innocent white woman corrupted by the sinister Chinese opium dealer became a staple of moral reform literature. In reality, most white women who used opiates consumed laudanum in the privacy of their own homes, prescribed by white doctors and purchased from white pharmacists. The Chinese opium den was never a significant factor in white addiction rates, but the racialized narrative was powerful, and it helped to shift public perception of opium from a generally acceptable medicine to a dangerous vice associated with racial contamination and moral decay. This set the stage for the first laws prohibiting opium in America, which were explicitly targeted at opium smoking rather than at the oral or injected forms that white Americans predominantly used. San Francisco passed a local ordinance in 1875 prohibiting opium dens, not because of concerns about public health, but because of racial animus toward Chinese immigrants. Similar laws spread to other western cities and eventually to some states. These were the first American drug prohibition laws, and their racist origins would cast a long shadow. In the early 20th century, the American social reform movement, driven by Protestant religious groups and progressive-era activists, began to focus more broadly on drug and alcohol use as social problems requiring government intervention. This movement believed that individual behavior should be regulated for the collective good, that the government had a responsibility to protect citizens from their own bad choices, and that certain behaviors, even when engaged in by consenting adults in private, were so harmful that they must be prohibited by law. Alcohol was the primary target of this movement, culminating in the disaster of prohibition from 1920 to 1933. But drugs, particularly opiates and cocaine, were also targeted. Reformers pointed to the growing number of addicts, to the social disruption and personal ruin caused by addiction, to the racial anxieties around Chinese opium dens and cocaine use among African Americans, which was subject to similar racist fearmongering. They demanded federal action. The result was the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914, a law that would fundamentally transform American drug policy and reverberate around the world for the next century. The Harrison Act was technically a tax law, not a prohibition. It required that anyone who imported, manufactured, sold, or distributed opium or coca products must register with the federal government and pay taxes. It required that these substances be labeled with their contents, and it required that they be dispensed only by prescription from a licensed physician for legitimate medical purposes. On its face, this seemed reasonable, a rational regulatory framework rather than outright prohibition. But the law was deliberately written in vague language that gave enforcement officials enormous discretionary power. The key phrase was legitimate medical purposes. Federal agents and prosecutors took the position that prescribing opiates to maintain an addict's habit was not a legitimate medical purpose, that addiction itself was not a disease requiring treatment with drugs, but rather a vice requiring punishment. Doctors who prescribed opiates to addicts to prevent withdrawal, a common and humane practice, found themselves arrested, prosecuted, and imprisoned. The American Medical Association, initially supportive of physicians' right to treat addicted patients as they saw fit, was intimidated into compliance. Thousands of physicians were arrested in the years following the Harrison Act's passage. Many lost their licenses. Some were imprisoned. The message was clear. Doctors must not maintain addicts on drugs. Addicts must quit, cold turkey if necessary. The result was catastrophic for America's addict population. Suddenly, people who had been able to obtain opiates legally, either through prescriptions or over-the-counter medications, found their supply cut off. Doctors were too frightened to prescribe. Pharmacies stopped stocking opiate-containing products or required prescriptions. Patent medicines were reformulated without opiates. Tens of thousands of Americans, most of them law-abiding citizens who had become dependent on opiates through medical use, were suddenly forced into withdrawal. Some succeeded in quitting, enduring weeks or months of agony, but eventually freeing themselves from dependence. But many could not. For them, the only option was to obtain drugs illegally. This created virtually overnight a black market for opiates. Criminal networks that had previously dealt in alcohol smuggling and other vice businesses discovered a new, highly profitable product. Opiate prices on the black market were many times higher than legal prices had been. Quality was unreliable, with products often adulterated or of unknown strength, and purchasing illegal drugs meant associating with criminals, risking arrest and imprisonment. The Harrison Act thus transformed addiction from a medical problem into a criminal justice problem. Addicts became criminals simply by virtue of possessing the drugs they needed to avoid withdrawal. This criminalization would define American drug policy for the next century, and through American influence, international drug policy as well. The international dimensions of drug control developed in parallel with American domestic policy. The United States, having conquered the Philippines in the Spanish-American War of 1898, found itself governing territories where opium use was common and where the colonial government derived revenue from opium sales. American administrators in the Philippines, many of them infected with the same moralistic reform spirit driving domestic drug policy, decided to prohibit opium in the Philippines as a matter of moral principle. This brought them into conflict with other colonial powers in Asia, particularly Britain, which continued to derive enormous revenue from opium production in India and sales in China. The United States convened an international commission in Shanghai in 1909 to discuss the opium problem, inviting representatives from all major powers with interests in Asia. This was the first international drug control conference, and it set important precedents. The United States pushed for international agreements to restrict the opium trade, framing the issue in moral terms as a battle against a terrible evil. Britain, more concerned with protecting its commercial interests, resisted any binding commitments, but eventually agreed to support gradual reduction in opium production and trade. The Shanghai Conference was followed by an international convention in The Hague in 1912, where the first international drug control treaty was signed. The Hague Convention committed signatories to enact domestic laws controlling the production and distribution of opium, morphine, heroin, and cocaine. This convention was initially signed by only a few nations, but it was later incorporated into the Treaty of Versailles ending World War I, making drug control obligations part of the post-war settlement, and extending them to all League of Nations members. The aftermath of World War I marked a turning point in the global opium story, though not in the direction that reformers had hoped. the war itself had created yet another generation of morphine addicts among wounded soldiers from all combatant nations. The carnage on the Western Front, with its trenches, artillery barrages, poison gas, and machine gun fire, produced casualties on a scale never before seen in human history. Millions of men were wounded, many grievously. Field hospitals administered morphine liberally, the only effective treatment for the unbearable pain of shrapnel wounds, burns, amputations, and gas exposure. As with the American Civil War, thousands of soldiers returned home dependent on opiates, their bodies unable to function without the drug they had been given as medicine. But the post-war period also saw something new and troubling: the emergence of a truly international criminal network dedicated to drug trafficking. Before the war, opium had been primarily a legal commodity, produced openly in British India, Ottoman Turkey, and Persia, traded through established commercial channels, and consumed either as medicine or in the quasi-legal opium dens of Asia and Western Chinatowns. The various prohibitions and restrictions enacted before and during the war had disrupted but not destroyed these legal markets. What they had done, however, was create enormous profit opportunities for anyone willing to operate outside the law. In the chaos following the war, with empires collapsed and new nations struggling to establish stable governments, smuggling networks proliferated. Opium and its derivatives could be purchased relatively cheaply in producing regions, smuggled across poorly guarded borders, and sold for spectacular markups in Europe and America, where legal supplies had been restricted. The prototype for modern organized drug trafficking emerged in this period. Criminal syndicates, often with roots in other illegal activities like gambling, prostitution, and bootlegging, recognized that drugs offered uniquely favorable economics. The product was compact and easily concealed, extraordinarily valuable relative to its weight, and the customers were literally addicted, providing reliable demand regardless of price. Moreover, the risks, while real, were manageable. Law enforcement agencies in most countries were small, under-resourced, and inexperienced in dealing with international smuggling networks. Borders were porous, inspection of cargo was sporadic, and corruption of officials was often easy to arrange. The profits from drug trafficking were so enormous that criminal organizations could afford to lose some shipments to seizure, or to pay substantial bribes, and still make fantastic returns. This basic economic logic, established in the 1920s, continues to drive the drug trade today. Turkey and Persia emerged as major sources of illegal opium in the interwar period. Both countries had long traditions of poppy cultivation, and both faced severe economic difficulties following the war. Opium represented one of the few cash crops that could be reliably exported for hard currency. The Turkish government attempted to regulate production, issuing licenses to farmers and trying to ensure that opium went only to legitimate pharmaceutical companies. But enforcement was weak, and much of the crop was diverted to smuggling networks. Persian opium, particularly the high-quality product from the region around Isfahan, became legendary among users for its potency and purity. From Turkey and Persia, the opium would be smuggled through multiple intermediaries, often converted to morphine base to reduce bulk, transported across Europe via routes through the Balkans or the Mediterranean, and finally refined into heroin in clandestine laboratories in France, particularly in Marseille. The French Connection, as this network would later be called, dominated the European and American heroin trade for decades, not broken up until the 1970s. Marseille's unique position as a port city with strong connections to both criminal underworlds and legitimate shipping, combined with France's sophisticated chemical industry and relatively lenient drug laws, made it the perfect hub for heroin production and distribution. China, meanwhile, was experiencing a temporary reduction in its opium crisis, though not through any deliberate policy success, but rather as a side effect of political chaos. The fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911 had ushered in a period of warlordism, with various military strongmen controlling different regions and the central government existing largely in name only. Many warlords financed their armies through opium, taxing production, monopolizing sales in their territories, or directly cultivating poppies on land they controlled. Opium became a de facto currency in some regions, with farmers forced to pay taxes in opium, rather than money. This actually made opium somewhat less accessible to ordinary users, because the warlords wanted to maximize revenue by selling to urban markets rather than allowing local consumption. The chaos also disrupted the old patterns of trade and consumption. Opium dens were shut down in some areas by warlords, trying to project moral authority, or simply because urban areas were depopulated by fighting. When the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek began to consolidate control over China in the late 1920s, it initially made anti-opium efforts a priority, recognizing that the drug had become symbolically associated with China's humiliation and weakness. Chiang launched highly publicized campaigns to destroy opium stockpiles, shut down dens, and even execute prominent dealers and addicts as examples. These efforts had some success in the nationalist-controlled areas, though they were undermined by the fact that Chiang's government, like the warlords before him, derived substantial revenue from opium taxes and controlled distribution. The communist insurgency led by Mao Zedong took a different approach. In the rural base areas they controlled, the communists implemented strict anti-opium policies, both from ideological conviction that opium represented foreign imperialism and capitalist exploitation, and from practical necessity, recognizing that opium-addicted soldiers and workers were ineffective. Anyone caught using or selling opium in communist-controlled areas faced harsh punishment, including execution in some cases. This created a striking contrast between nationalist and communist zones, which the communists exploited for propaganda purposes, presenting themselves as the moral purifiers of China, while portraying the nationalists as corrupt and tainted by association with opium. This narrative would later be deployed effectively during the Chinese Civil War that resumed after World War II, when the communists finally took control of all of mainland China. In 1949, they launched what is probably the most successful anti-drug campaign in history. Within just a few years, through a combination of coercion, mass mobilization, rehabilitation programs, and ruthless punishment of dealers and producers, the communist government essentially eliminated opium addiction from China, ending a crisis that had plagued the nation for over a century. The methods were brutal by Western standards, involving forced labor camps for addicts, public executions of dealers, and intense social pressure, but they were undeniably effective. By the mid-1950s, China's opium problem had been reduced to a tiny fraction of its former scale, a remarkable achievement that stunned international observers. World War II, like the First World War, disrupted global drug trafficking patterns while simultaneously creating new addiction problems. The Japanese occupation of much of China and Southeast Asia gave Japan control over major opium-producing regions. The Japanese military, despite officially adhering to international drug control agreements, cynically exploited opium as a tool of control and a source of revenue in occupied territories. They established opium monopolies in Manchuria and other occupied areas, using the revenue to finance military operations while also deliberately encouraging addiction among subject populations as a means of social control. A population numbed by opium, Japanese strategists calculated, would be less likely to resist occupation. After the war, when the extent of Japanese involvement in the drug trade became known through captured documents, it provided another example of how drugs had been weaponized by states for strategic purposes. The war also disrupted the supply routes from Turkey and Persia to European markets, forcing American users to seek alternative sources. Mexico, which had never been a major opium producer, began cultivating poppies in mountainous regions where climate and terrain were suitable. Mexican opium, while generally considered inferior in quality to Turkish or Persian product, was much closer to American markets and easier to smuggle across the porous border. This marked the beginning of Mexico's role in drug trafficking, a role that would expand enormously in later decades. In the post-World War II period, international drug control became increasingly institutionalized. The newly created United Nations took over responsibility for drug control from the defunct League of Nations, establishing the Commission on Narcotic Drugs in 1946. A series of international conventions in the 1950s and 1960s expanded and strengthened the legal framework for drug control, creating the system that essentially still exists today. The 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs consolidated previous treaties and established a comprehensive regime for controlling production, manufacture, trade and possession of opium, morphine, heroin and related substances. Countries that signed the convention, which was nearly universal, committed to prohibiting non-medical use of these drugs, to licensing and monitoring medical and scientific use, and to cooperating in suppressing illegal trafficking. The convention established schedules of controlled substances based on their medical utility and abuse potential, with heroin placed in the most restrictive schedule, prohibited even for medical use in most countries. The convention also required signatories to criminalize drug possession and trafficking, treating them as serious crimes warranting substantial punishment. This effectively globalized the American prohibitionist model, making it international law binding on virtually all nations. The 1960s and 1970s saw drug use patterns shift dramatically in Western countries, particularly the United States. A new generation, the baby boomers, came of age during a period of social upheaval, questioning traditional authority and values. Drug use became associated with the counterculture, with opposition to the Vietnam War, with the hippie movement and its emphasis on expanded consciousness and rejection of materialist society. Marijuana was the most widely used illegal drug among young people, but heroin also found new users, particularly in urban areas and among returning Vietnam War veterans. The Vietnam War created yet another generation of opiate-addicted servicemen, though this time the drug they used in Southeast Asia was often pure heroin rather than morphine. Heroin was widely available in Vietnam, cheap and potent, sold openly near military bases by dealers who recognized American servicemen as lucrative customers. Soldiers used it to escape the psychological horror of a brutal, confusing war that many did not believe in, to self-medicate for trauma and fear, to fill the long stretches of boredom between moments of terror. When they returned to the United States, many continued to use, bringing their addiction home with them. Studies suggested that perhaps 20% of American servicemen in Vietnam had used heroin, and perhaps half of those were addicted. This created a domestic crisis that helped spur President Nixon's declaration of a war on drugs in 1971. Nixon's war on drugs marked a significant escalation in American drug policy, transforming it from primarily a law enforcement issue into a militarized campaign with international dimensions. Nixon created the Drug Enforcement Administration (DEA) in 1973, consolidating various federal drug agencies into a single organization with broad powers and substantial funding. The DEA was tasked not just with enforcing drug laws domestically but with operating internationally, working with foreign governments to disrupt drug production and trafficking at the source. American agents were stationed in countries around the world, pressuring foreign governments to crack down on drug production, providing training and equipment for foreign drug police, and even conducting joint operations. This represented an unprecedented extension of American law enforcement power beyond its borders. The war on drugs also meant dramatically increased penalties for drug offenses. Mandatory minimum sentences were introduced, meaning that judges had to impose specified prison terms for drug offenses regardless of individual circumstances. These sentences grew increasingly harsh over the following decades. The three strikes laws of the 1990s meant that some drug offenders faced life imprisonment for relatively minor offenses. The prison population exploded, rising from about 300,000 in 1970 to over 2 million by 2000, with drug offenses accounting for a large percentage of that increase. The United States, despite having only 5% of the world's population, came to hold 25% of the world's prisoners, largely because of drug war policies. The war on drugs was also deeply racialized, though this was rarely acknowledged officially. African American and Latino communities were disproportionately targeted by drug enforcement. Despite evidence that drug use rates were similar across racial groups, the crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s, which devastated many urban communities, was met with ferocious law enforcement response. Laws established vastly different sentences for crack cocaine, used primarily in black communities, versus powder cocaine, used primarily by white users, even though they were pharmacologically almost identical. The result was that black men were imprisoned for drug offenses at rates many times higher than white men. By the 1990s, 1 in 3 black men could expect to be imprisoned at some point in their lives, compared to 1 in 17 white men, with drug offenses a major driver of this disparity. This mass incarceration destroyed families and communities, creating cycles of poverty and disadvantage that persist today. The war on drugs also provided justification for militarizing police forces, with departments acquiring military equipment and adopting military tactics for drug raids. No-knock warrants, SWAT team deployments, asset forfeiture laws that allowed police to seize property suspected of being connected to drug activity without having to prove criminal wrongdoing. These tactics were normalized in the name of fighting drugs, fundamentally changing the relationship between police and communities. Internationally, the war on drugs had profound and often counterproductive effects. American pressure on foreign governments to eradicate drug crops and arrest traffickers created instability and violence in many countries. In Latin America, the war on drugs became entangled with Cold War politics. Governments that were allied with the United States received military aid and support for anti-drug operations, aid that was sometimes used to fight leftist insurgencies that had nothing to do with drugs. Drug trafficking organizations facing government crackdowns became increasingly violent and sophisticated, evolving into the powerful cartels that would dominate Latin American politics for decades. In Colombia, the Medellin and Cali cartels fought brutal wars against the government and each other, corrupting institutions, assassinating judges and politicians, and terrorizing the population. When Colombian cartels were eventually dismantled in the 1990s, after enormous expenditure of resources and many lives lost, drug production and trafficking simply shifted to Mexico, where cartels became even more violent and powerful than their Colombian predecessors. This balloon effect, where suppressing drug trafficking in one location simply causes it to pop up somewhere else, has been a consistent pattern throughout the war on drugs, suggesting that enforcement-focused strategies cannot actually eliminate the drug trade but merely displace it. In Southeast Asia, the Golden Triangle region, where Burma, Thailand and Laos meet, became a major heroin production center in the 1970s and 1980s. The region's mountainous terrain and weak state control made it ideal for opium cultivation. Various ethnic insurgent groups, fighting against the Burmese government, financed their operations through opium production and heroin manufacture. The most notorious was the army of Khun Sa, a warlord who at his peak controlled an estimated 70% of the heroin entering the United States. Khun Sa operated with virtual impunity for decades, commanding thousands of armed men, controlling territory the size of several American states, and running a sophisticated drug production and trafficking operation. American DEA agents and State Department officials negotiated with him, tried to bribe him, and eventually indicted him, but he remained beyond reach until he negotiated a surrender deal with the Burmese government in the 1990s, retiring peacefully rather than facing justice. His career illustrated the limits of international drug enforcement against actors who controlled territory and had military force at their disposal. But it was in Afghanistan that the most consequential chapter in modern opium history would unfold. Afghanistan had produced opium for centuries, grown by farmers in the rugged mountains as a cash crop that could be transported easily and sold reliably. Production was relatively modest until the 1970s, overshadowed by the Golden Triangle and by Middle Eastern sources. But the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 and the subsequent decade-long war transformed the country into the world's largest opium producer. The Mujahideen resistance fighters, armed and funded by the United States, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia to fight the Soviets, needed revenue to sustain their operations. Opium provided that revenue. Mujahideen commanders taxed poppy farmers, operated their own fields, and facilitated the transport of opium to laboratories in Pakistan where it was refined into heroin. The CIA, focused on defeating the Soviets, turned a blind eye to this trade, prioritizing the anti-Soviet struggle over drug control. By the end of the Soviet occupation in 1989, Afghanistan was producing the majority of the world's heroin, and the country's economy had become deeply dependent on the drug trade. When the Soviets withdrew, Afghanistan descended into civil war among the various Mujahideen factions. Opium production continued to expand, now financing these internal conflicts. The country became a failed state, with no effective central government, warlords controlling different regions, all of them involved in the opium trade to some degree. In this chaos, the Taliban emerged in the mid-1990s, initially as a movement of religious students, Pashto Talibs, who promised to restore order and implement strict Islamic law. As the Taliban conquered territory, extending control over most of Afghanistan by the late 1990s, they faced the question of what to do about opium. Their initial position was pragmatic. While opium use was forbidden under their interpretation of Islamic law, they argued that growing opium for export to infidel nations was permissible. The Taliban taxed opium production heavily, with some estimates suggesting that drug revenues accounted for up to 40% of Taliban income. Under Taliban governance, opium production reached record levels. By 2000, Afghanistan was producing approximately 3,000 tons of opium annually, accounting for about 75% of global production. But in July 2000, in one of the most bizarre episodes in drug control history, Taliban leader Mullah Omar issued a decree banning opium cultivation throughout Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. The ban was remarkably effective. Within a single growing season, opium production in Afghanistan dropped by over 90% from 3,000 tons to just 185 tons. This was unprecedented. Never before had such a large drug production region been essentially shut down so quickly. The Taliban enforced the ban ruthlessly, burning fields, imprisoning violators, shooting repeat offenders. Their motivation remains debated. Some analysts believe it was a genuine religious conviction that opium cultivation was indeed un-Islamic, despite the earlier permissive interpretation. Others argue it was a strategic move to gain international legitimacy and recognition for the Taliban government, which controlled most of Afghanistan but was recognized diplomatically by only 3 countries. Still others suggest it was an attempt to manipulate the global heroin market, reducing supply to drive up prices for the large opium stockpiles that Taliban commanders had accumulated before the ban. Whatever the motivation, the ban demonstrated that opium production could be eliminated rapidly, given sufficient political will and coercive power, though at enormous human cost to the Afghan farmers, who depended on opium for their livelihoods, and who faced starvation when their income vanished overnight. The Taliban's opium ban was still in effect when the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks led to American invasion of Afghanistan. The United States and its NATO allies quickly overthrew the Taliban government, scattering its forces to rural areas and border regions. A new Afghan government, supported by Western powers, was installed in Kabul. One immediate consequence was the resumption of opium cultivation. Afghan farmers, who had suffered terribly during the ban year, immediately replanted their fields with poppies. Without Taliban enforcement of the ban, and with the new government having little control outside major cities, opium production rebounded rapidly. By 2002, production was back to pre-ban levels. By 2007, it had reached over 8,000 tons annually, more than double the previous peak. Afghanistan was now producing over 90% of the world's opium, an unprecedented monopoly. Ironically, the American military presence meant to bring stability and development to Afghanistan, presided over the largest expansion of drug production in history. American commanders faced an impossible dilemma. Attacking opium cultivation meant attacking Afghan farmers, many of whom were growing poppies because they saw no alternative. This would drive them into the arms of the Taliban insurgency, which was regrouping and promising to protect farmers from government and foreign interference. So American forces largely avoided targeting opium production, focusing instead on Taliban fighters and on interdicting drug shipments, a far less effective approach. The Afghan government, heavily dependent on American aid and support, officially opposed opium production and periodically launched eradication campaigns, sending teams to burn poppy fields. But these campaigns were selective and often corrupt, with wealthy and connected farmers able to protect their fields while poor farmers lost their crops. Eradication also proved counterproductive, angering farmers and pushing them toward the Taliban. Moreover, many Afghan government officials, from local police to provincial governors to ministers in Kabul, were themselves involved in the drug trade, either directly profiting from it or receiving payments from traffickers. The brother of President Hamid Karzai was widely believed to be a major drug trafficker, though this was never proven in court. The line between government and drug trafficking organization was often blurred to the point of invisibility. Afghanistan had become a narco-state, a country where the drug trade pervaded every institution and aspect of society, where attempting to eliminate opium would mean dismantling the entire economy and political structure. Experts estimated that opium-related income, including cultivation, processing, trafficking, and associated services, accounted for a third or more of Afghanistan's GDP. For individual provinces in the south and east where cultivation was concentrated, opium might be half or more of the local economy. Attempting to eliminate this would mean impoverishing millions of people, guaranteeing instability and insurgency. The story of opium in Afghanistan encapsulates the fundamental paradox that has defined humanity's relationship with this plant for thousands of years. What began as a medicine, a gift from the gods according to ancient Sumerians, has become an international crisis that governments seem powerless to solve, despite spending hundreds of billions of dollars and sacrificing countless lives in the attempt. When American forces finally withdrew from Afghanistan in 2021, after 20 years of occupation and nation-building efforts, opium production was higher than when they arrived. The Taliban, returning to power, initially maintained they would ban cultivation as they had in 2000, but facing economic collapse and mass starvation, they quietly allowed cultivation to continue in many areas while officially maintaining the ban. Another example of the impossible choices that opium forces upon those who govern territories where it is grown. The reality is that no external force can eliminate opium production in a region where it has become economically and socially embedded, without offering viable alternatives, and those alternatives require precisely the kind of long-term investment, stable governance, and economic development that war-torn regions lack. The medical community, meanwhile, has come full circle in its relationship with opiates. For most of the 20th century, following the addiction crises and moral panics of the early 1900s, physicians became extremely cautious about prescribing opioids for pain. The prevailing attitude was that opioids should be reserved for acute pain, for post-surgical recovery, and for terminal cancer patients. This changed dramatically in the 1990s when pharmaceutical companies, medical organizations, and pain specialists launched a campaign to reframe pain management. Pain, they argued, was being systematically undertreated. New formulations of opioids, particularly extended-release versions like OxyContin introduced by Purdue Pharma in 1996, were marketed as safe and effective for chronic pain management, with supposedly low addiction potential when used as prescribed. Pharmaceutical sales representatives assured doctors that addiction rates among pain patients taking opioids as directed were less than 1%, a claim based on flimsy evidence and later proven catastrophically wrong. The result was an explosion in opioid prescribing that would create the worst drug crisis in American history. Between 1999 and 2011, opioid prescriptions in the United States tripled. Pills flooded into communities across the country, but particularly into economically depressed areas where pain, both physical and existential, was endemic. Appalachian communities devastated by the decline of coal mining, Rust Belt cities hollowed out by factory closures, rural areas with disappearing economic opportunities. Many patients became dependent, requiring escalating doses to achieve the same effect. When their prescriptions ended, or when doctors tried to taper them down, these patients faced an agonizing choice: endure withdrawal and uncontrolled pain, or find another source for the drugs their bodies now required. Many turned to heroin, which was cheaper and more available than diverted prescription pills. By 2010, the opioid crisis was undeniable. Overdose deaths were climbing exponentially. The response, unfortunately, often made things worse. Rather than expanding treatment options, the focus was primarily on restricting prescribing. Many addicted patients found legitimate sources suddenly cut off and turned to street drugs, and the street drugs had changed. Heroin was being adulterated with or replaced entirely by fentanyl, a synthetic opioid approximately 50 times more potent than heroin. A dose that would fit on the head of a pin can be fatal. Fentanyl transformed the opioid crisis from a serious public health problem into an acute catastrophe. Overdose deaths skyrocketed. In 1999, there were approximately 20,000 drug overdose deaths in the United States. By 2021, the number had reached over 100,000, with synthetic opioids like fentanyl accounting for the vast majority. This is more deaths annually than from car accidents, more than from gun violence. Entire communities have been devastated, families have been destroyed. The opioid crisis has finally begun to shift attitudes toward addiction and drug policy. There is growing recognition that treating addiction primarily as a criminal justice problem has failed catastrophically. Some jurisdictions have implemented harm reduction strategies, needle exchanges to prevent disease transmission, supervised injection sites where users can consume drugs under medical supervision, and widespread distribution of naloxone, an opioid antagonist that can reverse overdoses. These measures save lives without increasing drug use rates. There is also growing acceptance of medication-assisted treatment for opioid addiction, using drugs like methadone and buprenorphine that satisfy opioid dependence without producing euphoria. Looking back over the 5,000-year history of humanity's relationship with opium, certain patterns emerge with striking clarity. Opium is extraordinarily effective at relieving pain and suffering, which is why every human society that has encountered it has made use of it. But it is also extraordinarily addictive, capable of enslaving users and destroying lives, families, and communities. Prohibition has never worked to eliminate opium use, and has consistently produced consequences worse than the problem it attempted to solve, creating black markets, empowering criminals, corrupting governments. Yet completely free availability, has also proven disastrous, as 19th century China demonstrated, leading to epidemic levels of addiction that devastated an entire civilization. The story of opium is ultimately a story about human vulnerability, about our desperate desire to escape pain, whether physical pain from injury and disease, or psychological pain from trauma, loss, and the simple difficulty of existence. As we face the ongoing opioid crisis, with overdose deaths still climbing, with fentanyl spreading into other drug supplies, with millions struggling with addiction, we must reckon with this history. The poppy that first bloomed in the Fertile Crescent 6,000 years ago, that the Sumerians called the joy plant, that crossed the ancient world on Phoenician ships, that the British forced on China at gunpoint, that created epidemic addiction in Victorian England and Civil War America, that financed Afghan warlords and Colombian cartels, is still with us. It will always be with us. The question is whether we can finally learn to live with it wisely, with compassion for those it harms, with humility about our ability to control it, and with determination to minimize its destructive power while preserving its beneficial uses. That is the challenge history has left us, and on our answer depends the fate of millions.